happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to our GMAT Club Veritas Prep collaboration session. I'm going to be speaking a little bit to breaking down data as it appears in critical reasoning questions. Now, by all means, feel free to jump into the chat for those of you tuning in live and just let us know where you're tuning in from. Feel free to ask questions as you have them. I'm hoping to have a really interactive lesson with you guys today. Lots of really cool stuff to cover, and I will say, this particular subtopic is one of my absolute favorites to teach because it's an area that can be easy to overlook if you're not necessarily on the lookout for it, but it's really easy to pick up on. It's really easy to make improvements accordingly if we know what to look for. And Daniel, to answer your question, yes, we will have this along with all of these videos in the series posted for available viewing later. Yeah, absolutely. So let's go ahead and actually kind of dig right in, because if you guys were able to tune into our last critical reasoning based session together, you noticed I spent a great deal of time talking about this idea of recognizing the gap. We spoke structurally a little bit about identifying conclusions, identifying the relevant premises or evidence behind those conclusions, and then identifying, all right, well, where's the gap? Right? What's the jump in logic between that premise or those premises and the corresponding conclusion? And this step can become even a bit more challenging when numbers are involved. Students tend to clam up a little bit when we have numbers inherent in our critical reasoning questions, because we want to think about things as verbal in a vacuum and quant in a vacuum, but it doesn't always quite work out that way. And so knowing to look out for and knowing to be scrutinous of data-driven values, whether they're values themselves, percents, averages, and how they could express something just a little bit different from what first meets the eye, can help you to gain a really powerful competitive advantage with this question style. So I want us to actually look at a couple of short examples of precisely what I mean by that. And feel free to jump into the chat and walk through this one with me. So if I posed an argument such that applications to the Harvard School of Management are down 10% this year, so the school should worry that it will not be able to maintain its high standards for incoming students. What is inherently a bit flawed? What holes can we poke in this argument? Where's the gap in reasoning? I'm Trey, to answer your question, should be right about at the hour mark, give or take a bit. So if I'm looking at this argument, applications to this School of Management are down 10%, so we've got some indicative conclusion language. The school should worry that it will not be able to maintain its high standards for incoming students. Anyone have any thoughts on what seems inherently or potentially a little flawed about this argument? And I will say there's not one right answer here. There are several ways that we can kind of spin through this example and think about how this potentially has flaw. Yeah, there we go, perfect. So incoming students won't be as good as present ones. Well, we don't necessarily know that. Applications being down doesn't necessarily indicate to us the quality of the students who are admitted. In fact, we could pose a situation such that perhaps this School of Management has added additional qualifications for applicants, and maybe there are just fewer unqualified or less qualified applicants even bothering to apply. Right? So in this case, we've got some problematic assumptions being made here around the use of this 10% decline in applications to conclude that the quality of incoming students will somehow decline, right? And similarly, if we kind of spitball through this second example, now I'm given the average GPA of the graduating class at Central High School is 20% higher this year than it was last year. Therefore, the current graduating class is significantly better qualified to succeed in college compared to last year's class. Anyone want to chime in on this particular example? And I will say several equally correct ways that we could scrutinize the use of this data. Awesome, yeah, so we've got a couple of follow-ups on that last one and pretty clearly a notable gap in reasoning. And this next question kind of begins to kind of gear into a slightly more convincing argument, but still flawed in several very notable respects. Anyone want to take a whack at this one? We've got the average GPA of the graduating class at Central High School is 20% higher this year than it was last year. Therefore, the current graduating class is significantly better qualified to succeed in college compared to last year's class. Well, once again, we're just looking for the gap in reasoning, the flaw in logic here. If we're trying to kind of poke holes here. Yeah, so there's certainly, just like that last example, there's certainly some sort of gap in reasoning to where they're equating higher GPA to better performance in college or better preparedness for college. What else? Ooh, good. So the average does not necessarily indicate to us the usual case. And we're actually going to spend a good deal of time talking about precisely that error in data-driven logic. Yeah, we could have a situation such that we've got a couple of students here that just knocked things out of the water and performed exceptionally well, but overall, more students saw a decline in that GPA. And then it wouldn't make any sense at all to make the jump that this increase in GPA, right, leads to better preparedness for college. Yeah, so initial GPA doesn't necessarily reflect the work they'll put in during their studies. And if I were trying to think through another example or two, another couple directions people make this, so the average may not be a clear indication to us, as we well know, and actually as I addressed in our last critical reasoning lesson, average is just flat out not always indicative of the usual case, and in fact can veer quite far from. And we could also pose a situation to where, all right, well, maybe we're in a situation to where some outside circumstances that we haven't considered are at play. Maybe we're in a situation to where grading parameters have become less strenuous, right? It's easier to achieve a higher grade. Maybe students were taking, on average, easier courses, right? So in many ways, we can take what seems like a somewhat reasonable argument and poke some pretty legitimate holes in it just on the basis of the use of our evidence to draw the conclusion we're drawing. All right, I want to take a look at another, and this one's pretty short and sweet, but I think we'll be able to jump out with some opportunities for improvement. Yeah, so the numbers at this school are trustworthy. All right, that's fair. It's probably a step farther than we usually see critical reasoning questions take things, but absolutely a means for scrutiny. Do we have the same parameters that we've had in the past around that GPA and how we've taken it into account? Sure. How about the average household income in the United States has increased by 2% over the last year, so most Americans are better off financially than they were at this time last year. So we've got a couple of similar flaws that we can branch out into, and then we have a couple of additional that I think are a little bit brand new to this particular example. Yeah, so average does not necessarily indicate to us that usual case scenario. Yeah, average does not necessarily mean most Americans are better off. What if that top 1% is just continuing to grow and the rest of us folks are not necessarily making gains? Yeah, what about inflation? What about cost of living, right? There are several ways that their overall financial position could have failed to improve despite the use of this piece of data that the average household income has increased. We don't even know if maybe perhaps we've had changes to the number of participants in any given household on average, right? Yeah, so there could be, again, more extreme positives shifting that average away from the usual case. Very, very nicely done. I've got one more for you guys, and it's a bit of a silly one, but it introduces a point that comes up very frequently in critical reasoning data-driven questions that I want to make sure we address here. So, I guess population size would be a thing to consider there as well. How about in this last one? More people die from choking on pretzels each year than are killed by great white sharks. Therefore, it is safer to swim with sharks than to eat pretzels. Anyone have some qualms with this particular example? More people die from choking on pretzels each year than are killed by great white sharks. Therefore, it is safer to swim with sharks than to eat pretzels. Don't worry, guys, hold on to your roll goals. Yeah, so the problem we run into here is that we could have, and very likely do have, abundantly more people eating pretzels than swimming with great white sharks on a regular basis. And so because we're basing these off of the overall population rather than the sample subset that we're looking at, yeah, we've created this kind of bizarre argument that if we had plugged in some information that seemed a little more convincing, may actually seem like it has some tout at first glance, but we need to make sure we take a step back and say, wait a second, I'm missing a pretty key piece of information here. Yeah, so most people don't swim with sharks, but there are a whole lot of folks eating pretzels on a day-to-day basis. So we've seen from these couple of examples where there are some common themes and then a couple of areas to where we might branch off in different directions around the use of data, how it might seem at first glance to suggest a particular conclusion, but ways that we can take things a step further, right, to think about how the data may not quite be supporting what we're looking for. And we're going to look at several examples of how that might be. I love that example. Nobody's died on Mars yet, therefore it's the safest place to be. No need for safety equipment whatsoever, astronauts. Have at it. Nobody's died yet. So, I love that. That's great. Yeah. So, with that in mind, I want to move us into some actual full GMAT examples. And I will say, first several of these are Veritas questions. The last one is a GMAT prep question, just as a quick aside. I know you guys tend to want to be warned if it may potentially spoil your practice test experience, but it's just such a good sample question. I want to make sure we go through it. So let's go ahead and dig in. And what I want us to do along the way is go through this process that, again, I mentioned very briefly at the start of this lesson of identifying the conclusion, identifying the premise, but then scrutinizing the data, thinking about how your own flawed assumptions may be weighing in to your analysis, and taking a step back to ensure that you can think about how the data may not reflect what it appears to on first glance. And I want us to look at this in the context of a first example that I'm going to go ahead and let you guys take 2 minutes to lead the way on. Now, we've got a poll set up for you so we can try to collect where folks are responding and help guide where I focus my time on the answer choices. So please feel free to respond in that poll. And what I'd love to give you guys the opportunity to do is to take 2 minutes to go ahead and dig into this question that asks us the answer to which of the following would be most useful for evaluating the expert's reasoning. So go ahead, take 2, and then we're going to circle back and talk a little bit about how data-driven questions can be broken down so long as we know what to look for along the way. right, let's go ahead and jump back into things. So, in terms of the poll response, I know I've got some folks participating in the chat. I'd like to try to keep us from spoiling the consensus too early on. So if you have the opportunity to let me know, at least while the timer's running in the polls as opposed to the chat, it helps us to make sure that no one's got anything swaying their perspective, and it helps me to get a collective sense of where you guys are responding so that we can kind of gauge where to spend our time talking through the answer choices. And I will say, your accuracy was quite high on this question, and I will say it is the easiest question of the set. It's why we've started with it. However, it introduces a really valuable point that we'll want to keep in mind here. And the point that it introduces is the fact that any statistic value, any percent that we might be given in a vacuum can't be all that meaningful or valuable to us. So if our wildlife expert here is telling us that recently a study of the gray wolf conducted in the regions bordering Yosemite National Park has revealed that 24% of the wolves do not live past adolescence. Right? Recent modifications to hunting laws and requirements are suspected of posing a detriment to the population of these species. Clearly, these recent changes are causing a decline in the population of the gray wolf, a species delisted from the endangered list only a few years prior. So let's talk about it. If we're concluding here that clearly the changes are causing a decline in population, why? Because 24% of the wolves don't survive past adolescence. Well, what's the gap or the flaw in reasoning here? Before we even move to our answer choices, can we get a sense of what to look out for along the way? Good, yeah. So if I'm looking at this argument, I'm saying, well, wait a second. Aren't there several reasons that these wolves might not survive past adolescence? What about predators? What about food scarcity, weather conditions? There are a number of different elements that could be impacting this mortality rate. And so we need something along the way that gave us reason to believe that the mortality rate was caused, at least in part, by the change in these rules. And we have no way of knowing that unless we know what to compare things back to. So for those of you who chose other answers along the way, whether we have a limit that exists that bars hunters from killing more than a certain set number does not on its own make or break the argument, right? Yeah, there may be many factors for this cited mortality rate. And we want to keep in mind a quick note on useful to evaluate questions. With our useful to evaluate questions, the answer choices we have, whether they're the results of a study or the answer to a question, the answer choices that we have to narrow in on our correct answer should address very specifically, should hinge on the potentially flawed assumption at hand. Basically, if we answer the question one way, it should leave us with a very likely valid conclusion. And if we answer it the other way, it should leave us with very likely an invalid argument. Right? So at this point, we want to look out for the opportunity that, well, if whether or not a limit exists does not on its own make or break our argument. It doesn't make or break whether these recent changes are to blame. Nor does the number of hunters increasing during this region. This could be true, it could be false, and it doesn't really directly impact our argument in any notable way, right? Whether gray wolves are protected from hunting by law in any of the regions included in the study, once again, and I will say this is arguably our most convincing wrong answer, right? Because we would assume, well, hey, if they're protected from hunting, then isn't this kind of a moot point? But we want to look out in any of the regions. Well, certainly we could have some regions where they might be protected and still have a valid argument, or fail to have a valid argument. And so our argument doesn't hinge directly on this piece of information. However, as many of you noted, answer choice D tells us prior to the changes cited, what percent of gray wolves live past adolescence, and that element on its own makes or breaks the validity of our argument. And when I say argument, I mean the argument as a whole, not the conclusion in a vacuum, but rather the connection between the use of the cited evidence to draw the conclusion we're drawing. Because if prior to the changes, right, 24%, 25%, 30%, right, of the wolves don't live past adolescence, well then this doesn't seem to be a pretty powerful conclusion, right? It doesn't make sense to use that 24% to draw conclusions. But if the normal mortality rate sits closer to 5%, maybe 10%, and it's made a jump to 24%, now we may be talking about something, right? And so the percent itself that we compare back to very directly influences whether or not we have a flawed or a likely valid argument, and thus D is the only one that addresses the question we've been asked for here. And once again, I don't believe anyone chose E, but how many wolves would need to be killed for the gray wolf to return to the endangered list? Pretty out of scope, doesn't address what we're looking to, and it's here to kind of distract us with this additional kind of context or premise that we have at the close of our argument, but doesn't directly impact the use of the data we have to draw the conclusions we're drawing. So we need to make sure along the way, whether it's something that jumps right out at you in your analysis of the argument, or whether it takes a little digging to get there, that a percent, right, this piece of data in a vacuum isn't particularly meaningful to us. We need something for it to refer back to. It's easy to read through and assume, all right, well, 24% didn't live. Well, that seems like a pretty notable percent of these wolves, but what if that's the normal mortality rate? What if the normal mortality rate is notably higher, and for some reason the effect of these hunters is helping those wolves out, right? So we want to look out for how the data has the potential to lead us to a different conclusion than the author of the argument cites to us and then first meets the eye. And I want to look at this in the context of a second example, and we're going to try to vary, right, the varieties of data-driven flaws we see today. And so the second one takes a slightly different avenue, but it's one of my all-time favorites for a couple of good reasons. We're now asked which of the following, if true, undermines the argument above. So once again, we're going to take 2 minutes, have you guys take a look at this one on your own, follow up with a little bit of a conversation, and address any questions here. So we're looking for a weakener here, and we're asked which of the following, if true, undermines the argument above. Go ahead, take 2, and if you don't mind, respond in those polls for me. All right, let's get back to it. So I have admittedly jumped up the difficulty level just a smidge on this one. And to preface, these are meant to be challenging questions. So moving forward, the remainder of our questions will all be 700 plus level questions moving through. But I want to draw attention to the fact that these higher level questions aren't higher level because they're notably more obscure in content or have expectations of knowledge in whatever the content area that's being tested happens to be. Instead, we've abstracted things by making the potentially flawed data a little more convincing, and by putting us in a position to where the correct answer doesn't jump right off the screen at us. It's not punchy, it may not necessarily be phrased the way we thought we were looking for, and some of our convincing wrong answers seem a little closer to the way we might have verbalized things. So in this case, we've got a pretty decent split across our answer choices for those of you who participated in the poll. So by all means, as we're moving through, feel free to jump in with questions that you have around the wrong nature of the answer that you may have chosen, and we'll go ahead and move through. So we have here that durability is the measure of how long a certain appliance remains functional without breaking down, and that 60 years ago, average refrigerator durability was 15 years. Now refrigerators operate continuously for more than 40 years on average. So we have this increase in the average durability of refrigerators. Now we're concluding, we have this conclusion language here. Thus, at that time, people must have considered refrigerators to be nearing the end of their operational lives at an age that we now consider will leave many more working years. Katie, to answer your question, you will, I believe, have to wait until the entire video is posted to circle back and catch the beginning, but please feel free to do so. Ask any questions in the comment function as you have them, and I'll be sure to circle back to them. Yeah. And so, if we're looking to undermine the argument, we first need to try to note the difference in language that we have here between our premise and our conclusion, because many students, I get this feedback all the time in this question when working with one-on-one students is, well, isn't it kind of just saying the same thing twice? Right? But if we dig in, if we look out for precision in language, if we look out for how the data can express things differently than what first meets the eye, we're told here that our average refrigerator durability has increased. Right? So we have an increase in this average durability, and we're using that to include that we would have an increase in the expected durability. All right, so therefore we've got an increase in this expected durability. So can anyone tell me what's the gap here between we've had an increase, a notable increase in the average durability of refrigerators, therefore we would have an increase in our expected durability? Anyone want to speak to me a little bit around the gap in reasoning that exists here? And I will say, it may not jump right out at you in this case. It's far more subtle than the last example, and in many cases, this particular structure, while a common one, can be pretty tricky for students. So if it didn't jump right out at you on first glance, we don't want to kill a ton of time. We can start to utilize some process of elimination to get there. So this is interesting. So let's talk a little bit about technology improvement. So I'm assuming you're speaking to answer choice C here. Right? Many of the refrigerators that last an extremely long time today do so only because of engineering technology that was not available 60 years ago. So, if this is what we're looking at here, does the engineering technology that exists address or draw attention to the gap in reasoning between average and expected? Well, no, not really. In fact, if anything, answer choice C that tells us the technology has improved actually just strengthens the existence of our evidence, right? It doesn't even strengthen the connection between premise and conclusion, right? It just strengthens the existence of our evidence. It gives us better reason to believe that average durability has improved, right? But it doesn't address the potential gap between average durability and expected durability. And that precision in language, that difference in the language that's been used is what tells us that's what we're looking for. So let me circle back to this other point. We're assuming that average is the same thing as expected, and that's exactly what I'm looking for here, right? We've used our average case. We've used the data around our average to draw conclusions about the expected, or in other words, usual case. Right? And we know, based on the previous examples we went through, that average is not always indicative of expected. Couldn't we be in a position to where we would always have expected refrigerators to last 40 years, but so many of them were faulty and broke down in the first year, broke down in the first 6 months, that it dragged that average down from 40 to 15? So though subtle, answer choice B addresses precisely that. Answer choice B tells us most of the improvement, so most of this change, has been a result of, has been achieved through cutting down on the number of refrigerators that break down in the first year of ownership. Right? So if we're in a position to where, yeah, the usual case hasn't changed all that much, we just have fewer faulty refrigerators unduly shifting the average, well, we've got an answer that weakens the potential connection between average and expected. So we want to look out for opportunities here. So B is our correct answer here, despite the fact that it doesn't necessarily seem all that relevant on first glance. And this actually brings up a secondary point. In critical reasoning, don't eliminate an answer choice because you don't see how it connects on first glance. Leave it be, eliminate low-hanging fruit, and circle back to it. Because in many cases, especially as we move into high-level questions, our correct answer won't be quite as punchy. It won't be quite the way we might have phrased it, but it'll carry the meaning we thought that we knew we were looking for along the way. So let's talk through our other convincing wrong answers here. So the population size of refrigerator owners is pretty clearly irrelevant here when establishing the connection or lack thereof between average and expected. And if we move down to answer choice D, the proportion of refrigerators that break down when they're between 35 and 40 years old is significantly smaller today than is the proportion that break down after 40. Well, if more refrigerators break down post 40 today than between 35 and 40, gosh, if anything, this very vaguely strengthens once again the existence of our evidence, right? So that's certainly out of the mix. So let's talk a little bit about E. And I will say, generally speaking, when students answer choice E on this question, it's because they've used process of elimination, they didn't really like answer choices A through D, and they went, well, must be E then, choose it, and move along. But we want to make sure that we're taking the same level of scrutiny all the way through our answer choices. Just because we're down to 2 possibilities or down to 1 possibility, we don't want to take a step back in terms of the level of scrutiny we take through our answer choices. We want to be equally scrutinous, and if that means that occasionally we need to circle back and bring something back into the running because we didn't find any of those answers to be convincing, we want to do so because it gives us the opportunity that we might be able to circle back to something like answer choice B, where initially we eliminated it because we just didn't see the connection, and now we realize we need to take a step further into the connection that exists. So something like answer choice E that tells us more refrigerators 60 years ago received regular service than receive it today, well, the level of service we receive does not in any way impact the connection between average and expected. It doesn't expose any sort of flaw in reasoning that tells us that our average does not indicate to us the expected or usual case. Only answer choice B does so, despite the fact that, again, the first couple of words on first glance, it didn't necessarily seem like the most convincing answer. So we want to make sure we take the same level of scrutiny into these answers. And as a quick aside otherwise, because this is another big picture element that a lot of students tend to run into trouble with. If you're the type of student, and most of us are in at least some regard, right? If you're the type of student who generally is able to narrow down to 2 answer choices and then runs into trouble from there and tends to select the wrong one between the 2, if that's your usual kind of wrong answer scenario when you miss questions, be sure that when you circle back to your remaining 2, your remaining 3 answer choices, once you've eliminated what is obviously incorrect, don't go between those 2, sit back and forth and choose the one that sounds the best to you. Find something definitively wrong about all but one of those answer choices, because again, on high-level questions, we'll generally speak more to looking out for opportunities to where there's something about an otherwise convincing answer choice that makes it wrong, rather than picking the one that sounds the best or sounds the closest to what you thought you were looking for. Yeah, so let's walk back through answer choice C again, right? So really briefly, let's walk back through answer choice C. So Many of the refrigerators that last an extremely long time today do so only because of an engineering technology that wasn't available before. Does not let us know, right? It doesn't address the potential gap between average and expected. And if we've taken a moment to break down what that looks like, then we put ourselves in a position to where anything that just doesn't address that connection isn't what we're looking for, right? And I will say, yeah, so fixating on, I love this, fixating on finding the right answer is time consuming. If you're going back and forth between answer choices, trying to figure out, trying to make a case for each of these answer choices and how it could be correct, you're likely spending a lot of time that isn't necessarily adding a ton of value. Whereas, if you can give it one kind of second round through your answer choices, look to be scrutinous and look to find something definitively wrong about one of those two remaining answer choices, we generally cut down on a process to where you kind of lose track of time and end up investing 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes in a question, right? It puts you in a position to where if you can build the structure around your approach, if you know, hey, once I've narrowed down, if I'm running into trouble between the two, I don't sit and piecework or puzzle those answer choices back into the argument over and over again. Instead, I'm scrutinous, I look out for something wrong about one of those two answers, I choose the other one, and I move forward. There are many cases, and again, I'd be happy to hang out in the chat function after our lesson, just so I'm not throwing everybody too far off of the original game plan, and chat a little bit about how those pacing strategies apply in questions like these and on others. So what does that time refer to in the conclusion? So, thus at that time being the 60 years ago, right? People must have considered refrigerators to be nearing the end of their operational life at an age that we now consider will leave many more working years. So it draws the comparison in the premise and then continues that comparison in the conclusion. All right, awesome. So certainly a challenging question. I will say structurally a question very similar to elements you could expect to see out of many official questions and potentially on test day. So certainly something to be on the lookout for. So C does not link average and expected because all it does is it gives us a good reason why the average might have increased. But it doesn't give us reason why the average might have increased, but the expected would not have. Right? It doesn't give us a lack of alignment between average and expected. Well, if engineering technology increased and refrigerators are generally lasting longer, well then yes, we would expect that refrigerators are going to last longer. It aligns with our argument. It aligns with our evidence. It does not weaken it. Yeah, it strengthens as opposed to weakening it. And I will say it is hands down, universally when I go through this question with students, it is hands down the most convincing wrong answer because it sounds the most relevant. But we want to be careful because if it's relevant in the wrong direction, it's our wrong answer. And that tends to actually be some of the quickest means for elimination. Is not eliminating because you don't see the connection, but rather eliminating when it's clearly impacting the argument in the wrong way. So try to verbalize, how is this impacting the argument? If it's not the way that we're trying to address the argument, it's out. All right, jump in with lingering questions if you have them. Otherwise, we're gonna keep on keeping on, but the kind of big picture takeaway that I wanna make sure you guys are gathering out of this question is that, first of all, average is not always indicative of usual case, right? Average is simply just the sum of the numbers over the number of numbers, and that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about that usual or expected case. And we want to make sure along the way that we're looking out for ways that the assumptions you place on the argument could be flawed. So for instance, if I briefly circle back, it's really easy to read through this stem and say, all right, average refrigerator durability was 15 years, so most refrigerators used to last 15 years. Now, refrigerators operate continuously for more than 40 years. It's really easy to read through this and assume, well, most refrigerators used to last 15 years, now most last 40 years, but that's just flat out not necessarily the case, right? So with that in mind, I want us to take this same line of thinking, take this scrutiny toward data-driven elements as they appear, and take a look at another example that's gonna shift us a slightly different direction. So now we're asked, which one of the following, if true, would most strongly counter the city official's response? So same question style, slightly different prompt here. I'm gonna go ahead and put 2 minutes up on the board for us, and then I'm happy to address during that 2 minute mark any questions that you guys have in the chat for me. So go ahead, take 2, and then we're gonna circle back and see where we get. And along the way, we're definitely gonna chat about how we can start to whittle away on time a little bit with these number-based arguments that embed numeric concepts, statistics, because you're right, they can tend to be time-consuming if we're not careful about the procedure, about the process, about the way we think about these questions. So I'm gonna let you guys go ahead and lead the way. I'll circle into the chat, and then we'll go ahead and talk about this in 2 minutes. All right, folks, let's go ahead and run through it. So before I address the argument itself, I will say some dispersion among the answer choices, but pretty overwhelmingly, you guys are on a really good track with this question. And we'll want to make sure that along the way, admittedly, we're doing a little bit of hand-holding through this lesson. I've introduced to you guys, I've mentioned that all of these questions will in some respect deal with the numeric concepts at hand. However, we'll want to make sure that we're on the lookout here. Now everyone's jumping in on the bandwagon, that we're on the lookout here for how to identify cues, how to identify indicators, relevant information that may allow us to recognize that the data-driven element of the question is what we'll want to be scrutinous of when we encounter it in general practice as well, not just when it's kind of the title and theme of the webinar. So as we're moving through, we want to make sure we recognize which one of the following, if true, would most strongly counter the city official's response. We want to make sure we're countering the correct perspective here. And we've got our citizen here who tells us that each year since 1970, a new record has been set for the number of murders committed in this city. This fact points to the decreasing ability of our law enforcement system to prevent violent crime. And our city official responds by saying, "You overlook the fact that the city's population has risen steadily since 1970. In fact, the number of murder victims per 100 people has actually fallen slightly." So let me once again ask you, and I know it's a bit of a repetitive question, but it's a really important one. Where's the gap here? What's the gap in reasoning with how the city official responds by saying, hey, our murder rate's actually fallen. Thus, we have not decreased in the ability of our law enforcement to prevent violent crime. What's the flaw or the gap in reasoning that we very likely will need to address when moving through these answer choices? Anyone have thoughts for me here? And I'm gonna put a quick pin on the pacing end of things, and we'll take a couple of moments for those of you who wanna stick around post-webinar and chat a little bit about that element. So yeah, so let's talk about this. So number of murders versus murder victims. All right, so that'd be a tricky one to make a case for, but let's go ahead. Yeah, so if we're looking at our city official's response, the city official is using the number of murder victims per 100 people. Now I will say, want to be careful because number of murder victims per 100 people is a percent-based statistic, right? It's a per capita statistic, right? It's not a hard value. And we're using that to respond here to an argument that's made about violent crime. So certainly the citizen makes a mistake of saying that because a record number has been set, right, we are less able to prevent violent crime. The citizen certainly makes that mistake, but we want to make sure we're answering the question that's being asked, right? Because in this case, the fatal flaw, the gap in reasoning that the city official holds in his or her argument is that the number of murder victims per 100 people, the murder statistic, is responding to a claim about violent crime, and murder is only one facet of violent crime, right? So the victims would be the recipients of the murder, I suppose, or of the violent crime in general. So let's talk about it. So as we move through our answer choices, we had several folks linger on answer choice C. So I want to start there by talking through answer choice C. Because answer choice C tells us murders and other violent crimes are more likely to be reported now than they were in 1970. In what way does answer choice C impact our argument? Murders and other violent crimes are more likely to be reported now than they were in 1970. Does this counter the city official? Or does this align with and strengthen? Yes, this strengthens what the city official is trying to say. If we know, hey, we're actually accounting for closer to everybody, and that rate has fallen slightly, this strengthens what the city official has to say. So certainly relevant, but relevant doesn't make it right. We can have answer choices that are relevant in completely the opposite direction of what we're looking for, and in many cases, those are some of our most convincing wrong answers. Answers that just address a slightly different question than the one we've been asked. Now, if we run through our other answer choices, the incidence of fraud has greatly increased in the city since 1970. Well, fraud certainly doesn't have anything to do with violent crime or murder as a whole, right? So let's talk about how it strengthens. Sure, let's circle back to this. So if murders and other violent crimes are more likely to be reported, if we're missing fewer of them in our reports, and the murder rate has fallen slightly, this tells us that we don't run into a situation where the city official could be wrong because they're missing some along the way. We're running into a situation to where this decline is probably actually even a step further. It may be even more notable because we're accounting for more of the situations at hand and still seeing the decline. Is that making a little more sense? Yeah, so C does not weaken, it strengthens the argument at hand. Yeah. And if we circle into answer choice B, the age of the victims, while a little harsh to say, doesn't really matter to us here. And the number of law enforcement officials increasing at a rate judged to be sufficient certainly doesn't notably weaken the city official's response, right? Yeah, so once again, we're out here. So let's talk a little bit about answer choice C. Because students tend not to like answer choice C very much for the same reason we ran into a little bit of trouble on that last question, right? We have, if the healthcare received, well, wait a second, what the heck does healthcare have to do with anything, right? But if the healthcare received by assault victims, so victims of violent crime, last year had been of the same quality as it was in 1970, the murder rate in the city would have turned out to be several times what it actually was. So now we're in a position where we're looking at this and saying, wait a second, it's not that we're better served to prevent violent crime, it's that our healthcare has gotten so abundantly better that fewer people are dying as a result of that violent crime. So this gives me good reason to believe that a murder statistic is not a proper way of addressing a violent crime trend, because answer choice E gives me reason to believe that the murder rate is non-indicative of overall violent crime. So jump in with questions if you have them. So for which critical reasoning question types we need to find the gap? So any of our core question types that task us to strengthen, weaken in some regard. So our core strengthen and weaken questions, our evaluate questions, our assumption questions, even questions that take this into a different perspective where we're strengthening or weakening a plan of action, situations to where we're resolving the paradox, which is really just another subset of a strengthened question. So any situation to where we have an argument that is designed to pose us with evidence, conclusion, and a gap therein. So as a quick for instance with inference questions, right, we're drawing the conclusion, so the argument on its own may not inherently have this kind of gap in reasoning between premise and conclusion, but with any variation of strengthen and weaken questions, it's definitely something we're going to want to keep in mind. And to very briefly address the pacing end of things, this sounds very counterintuitive, and I've mentioned it in an earlier session in this webinar series. In many cases, we save ourselves time in the long run by taking a step back and front-loading our time on the analysis portion of the question. Taking just a moment's pause before we jump right into the answer choices to say, okay, is there a direction, right, that they're looking for me to take? Is there a clear flaw? Is there something that I can already jump in and say, all right, they're almost certainly going to ask us to address this glaring flaw in logic? So do we believe that GMAT tests the same things in critical reasoning regularly? So structurally, there are a lot of common patterns and themes when we look to some of their older materials versus newer materials, when we look to the feedback and responses of those who have tested years ago versus recently. I will say that there's been some feedback, and again, don't quote me on the statistics, but there has been some feedback to the effect that statistics as they appear on critical reasoning questions are a somewhat increasing trend. Yeah, so let's talk through E. So if the healthcare received by assault victims last year had been of the same quality, so if healthcare hadn't improved, the murder rate would have been several times what it actually was. So if healthcare hadn't improved, then we'd be in a position to where the murder rate would just be above and beyond larger than it actually was, right? So this tells us that we're not better equipped to prevent violent crime. There's still a whole heck of a lot of violent crime happening, just less of that violent crime is resulting in murder because our hospital systems, our healthcare, etc., our emergency responders are more well equipped to save those involved in violent crime. And if we circle back to C once again, we'll go through it one more time, and then beyond that, I'm happy to hang afterwards in the chat and answer lingering questions. I want to make sure for those of us who planned on an hour that we're able to get you through the final two questions that I have for you, because they're good ones. So with answer choice C, murders and other violent crimes are more likely to be reported now. If they are currently more likely to be reported than they used to be, that means we're accounting for closer to everything and the rate has dropped. Which means that if all other things had been equal, right, if we were not more likely to report things now, then we would expect that this murder rate would be even lower if it were an even comparison. So what this tells me is that it strengthens the argument because it tells me that we're accounting for closer to everything. There's no possibility that we just appear to have a decline because we aren't catching or seeing people, right? It's telling us quite the opposite. We're addressing closer to all of these, right? And so it tells us that the city official is likely on the right track with this statistic, other than that notable flaw of murder statistics to respond to overall violent crime. Awesome. Okay, so with that in mind, kind of pulling things together to the bigger picture takeaway associated here, we want to look out for ways that data can seem impactful, but ultimately lack a meaningful connection to the conclusion, right? So in many of these cases, yeah, we had some potentially punchy, what seemed to be meaningful statistics or what seemed to be powerful statistics, but they either lacked a connection to the argument at hand or they addressed the connection in the opposite way. right? So we want to be on the lookout, because I will say, and I can't reiterate this enough, some of our most convincing wrong answers are just really great answers to a different question. So pay close attention and make sure that your pattern recognition doesn't just take you through the question, and instead you can take a step back to address the question that's being asked. All right. So let's go ahead and keep on keeping on. And again, happy to hang afterwards and chat through a little more of the specifics here. For the time being, I want to give you guys the opportunity to tackle this next example. So now we're told, which of the following identifies a problem with the service's attempt to validate its ranking? So slightly different question structure. And I will say slightly different data-driven flaw. But I don't want to give too much away, so go ahead, take two, see where you get in the polls on this one, and then we'll circle back and talk about it together. All right, let's talk about it. So a lot of folks on the right track with this question, super encouraging stuff. So we've actually just in the last maybe 30 seconds or so seen the answer choices jump to where everyone shifted away from a couple of the most convincing wrong answers, right, into ultimately what we're looking for. And ideally, it's because you took a moment to take a step back and say, wait a second, where's the gap here? How could this reflect differently than what first meets the eye, right? So if we've got here this college football recruiting service ranking incoming players on a scale of 1 star to 5 star, and the service is attempting to validate its rankings by assigning star ratings to players upon completion to basically see how they align and where they don't. The survey averaged the post-career ratings of each player and found that 5 stars players' final average was 4.46, whereas for 4 stars it was 3.98, and for 3 stars it was 3.11. So this suggests, so now we've got our conclusion language, that the ranking services do not effectively judge high-end talent as well as they judge players in the middle of the range. Now, for those of you who answered a different answer than the overwhelmingly answer of B, make sure we keep in mind the conclusion here is that the ranking services are less effective at judging the top talent. The conclusion is not that the ranking services are ineffective as a whole. So answer choices that just address why they may not be effective in general do not bridge the gap in what we're looking for here. They don't address the potential flaw in logic. So let me ask you this, what is the gap? And it's been the ultimate question of today, but for good reason. And don't worry, we're gonna be circling into the last example as well. It's one that I think is too good to miss. So where's the gap in reasoning here? What's the gap in logic? So we've got these statistics, right? That 5-star final averages were 4.46, 3.98 for 4 stars. Well, gosh, that's a whole lot closer to 4 than 4.46 is to 5, right? And 3.11 for 3 stars. But yeah, I want to be scrutinous of these averages because I know that one, average is not indicative of my usual case. And in this case, this is kind of an exception to the rule. Because in some cases, we won't be following a usual pattern for the data-driven flaw. In several of the past examples, we were, right? In several of our past examples, there was a really common element that shows up really regularly in questions, and we knew to look out for it. We addressed it in one of those sample questions at the very front end, and we were in good shape. However, there's something specific about this. There's a specific gap in reasoning that tells us even though the 5-star average is farther from 5 than the 4 and 3-star averages are from 3, this doesn't necessarily tell us that they're more accurate at the lower level because a 5-star player's final average, right? A 5-star player's final average can't be over or outperformed. Whereas with my 3-star players, well, they could be completely inaccurate as a whole and guess a whole bunch of 4 stars and a whole bunch of 2 stars that average me back to 3, right? For my 4 stars, I could have guessed a whole bunch of 5 stars and a whole bunch of 3 stars that averaged me out to 4. So this doesn't necessarily tell me that on a case-by-case basis, I'm more accurate at judging 4-star and 3-star talent. What it tells me is that the system's inherently a little flawed, right? And so again, for those of you who chose anything other than answer choice B here, a 5-star scale does not allow the most elite players to overperform their initial ranking. There's no way that a 4-star and a 6-star averages me back to 5 and gives me the same closeness I can anticipate out of my 3 and 4-star rankings. For those of you who chose different answer choices along the way. So we had several folks with C, a couple of folks with E. Players may change positions and be judged at multiple positions, or because of differences in strength training programs, they may move differently, right? Their level may change. It addresses why the service may not be accurate as a whole. It does not address the potential gap between saying, because we're closer to our rankings for 4 and 3 stars, the ranking services do not effectively judge high-end talent as well as they do those in the middle of the range. So we need to make sure we're answering the question that's being asked. So for something like answer choice E, because of differences in strength training programs at different schools, players may develop at different rates. The issue we run into here is that actually really none of our other answer choices here even remotely addresses why we would expect the difference for the most elite players to be greater than the difference for mid-end talent, right? So but the trick to keep in mind here is when we talk about scope, and scope tends to be one of the most misapplied concepts in GMAT critical reasoning, right? When we talk about scope, we need to make sure we're addressing the argument and the gap in reasoning that's being addressed, because it's easy to shift our frame of thinking to kind of allow mental inertia to take over and to say, oh, well, we're trying to see why they may not be effective, right? But that's not actually what the argument tasked us to do. The argument tasked us to identify a flaw in saying that high-end talent is less well-judged than middle-range talent, right? We needed something that specifically addressed that element. And things like differences in strength training programs and changes of positions and transferring to different schools, right? And whether they're harder to judge at a younger age. All of these other answer choices apply to everybody in the mix. They don't apply to high-end talent versus mid-range talent differently. However, answer choice B tells me, well, hey, there is a reason this 4.46 is farther from 5, and it's not because they're less accurate. I could be in a position to where, gosh, most of the time they correctly address that 5-star players are 5 stars, but then there are a couple of folks that just don't have the belief and knock them down at 1 star, and it knocks things down to 4.46. Whereas, we could be in a position with our 4-star players where almost no one is judged effectively, but there are so many that are rated as 5 stars or 3 stars that they average their way back to be very near to the desired outcome. Yeah, so in many cases, we'll want to look out for ways that the data, even if it doesn't follow a usual pattern or a usual case situation, could reflect differently than the way we initially interpret it. And in this case, it was a little bit of a combination of the average isn't always indicative of usual case that we spoke about, but also the fact that, hey, 5-star systems, we've got a little bit of an inherent flaw there, right? Yeah, exactly. So with that in mind, just in general, we want to make sure we're seeking out ways to disprove the relevancy of the data, not the data itself. And this was big for a couple of the answer choices we had here, and it's huge for questions moving forward as well. Because we want to look out for cases to where we're not trying to strengthen or weaken the evidence, right? We're not trying to address the evidence in a particular way. The evidence has been given to us as fact, right? What we're trying to do is say, okay, if we know our evidence is true, how could it lack a meaningful connection to our conclusion? Right? And so, yeah, so if we're in a situation to where, even to circle back to your point, even most of the cases, right, our 5-star player's final average was right on the dot, but a couple of them shifted them down, there's no way for 5-star players that overestimates could shift them up. That's the issue we run into that differentiates a 5-star player's average and its meaning, right, how indicative it is, versus 4 stars and 3 stars. So in some cases, we can utilize pattern recognition to look out for particular areas of data. In other cases, we may need to veer off the grid a little and see what is potentially flawed on a case-by-case basis. All right, so let's go ahead and circle through one more example, and it's one of my all-time favorites. And again, to circle back with one final warning, it is a GMAT prep question, but it's just such a good one that I want to make sure we take a moment to talk about it. We are asked, in assessing whether the data cited provided support for the position taken about motorcyclists taking the courses, it would be most useful to determine which of the following. So I want to let you guys once again lead the way, take 2 minutes, post your answers in the polls, and talk to me a little bit about this useful to determine question and the potential data-driven flaws that it incorporates. All right, so I've given us a little extra time to try to circle back, but I recognize you guys may not have all quite participated. By all means, feel free to do so in the chat now if you'd like. Not a problem at all. So let's go ahead and run through it. So for those of you who participated, we have a little bit of a winning streak over on answer choice A, but some pretty frequently chosen answer choices kind of across the board. So let's make sure we chat through it. So we've got these motorcycle safety courses offered by a number of organizations that teach motorcyclists important techniques for handling and for safely sharing the road with other users. If more motorcyclists took these courses, there would be fewer serious motorcycle accidents. Data show that 92% of motorcyclists who are involved in a serious accident have never taken a course. So let's go ahead first and foremost and make sure that we're properly identifying the conclusion, premise, and relevant gap between the two. Because in this case, we haven't closed off our argument with the conclusion. It's been nestled kind of in the middle here, right? If more motorcyclists took these courses, there would be fewer serious accidents. We're basically saying the motorcycle courses aid in eliminating potential accidents. Right? So yeah, so this one's great because if we know what to look for in the data, it jumps right off the page at you. But if we don't, it's really easy to let these convincing wrong answers creep their way into your analysis. So in this case, if we're using the data that 92% of motorcyclists involved in an accident have never taken the course to conclude that the courses decrease your likelihood of being involved in an accident, where is the gap in reasoning here? And again, if it didn't jump out at you, you can certainly use process of elimination to get there. Yeah, so in this case, if we're looking at the connection or the lack thereof between 92% of motorcyclists have never taken a course, and if more motorcyclists took these courses, there would be fewer serious accidents, we want to look and evaluate the reasoning question and a useful to determine question. We want to evaluate whether this data makes sense to draw the conclusion we've been given. And so if we move through our answer choices, and I'm actually going to take things in reverse order here, right? If we move through our answer choices, and I want to walk through this path for the sake of making sure that for those of you for whom this didn't jump right off the page at you, we can take a step back and utilize process of elimination as a primary means. So whether variations in the size and potential speed of a motorcycle influence the risk of a serious accident occurring. If I answer that question, yes, the size makes a difference, or no, the size does not make a difference, it doesn't on its own make or break our argument. It doesn't leave us with a likely valid or likely invalid argument, nor does whether more than 92% of serious motorcycle accidents involve collisions between a motorcycle and another vehicle in motion. Now they've kind of tried to trap us into saying, hey, I saw that statistic before, it must be my correct answer. But if I think about this, right, if I answer that yes, more than 92% involve collisions with another vehicle, or no, they don't involve collisions with another vehicle, again, it doesn't make or break my argument. And that's what I'm looking for out of an evaluate the reasoning question, right? So answer choice D is out of the mix as well. And if I look to see whether the different organizations that offer courses differ in the content that they offer, right? So whether they differ in the content they offer doesn't make a difference either. Once again, if I answer the question yes, and if I answer the question no, it doesn't one way make and the other way break my argument as a whole, right? So that one's pretty clearly out. And if I circle into B, whether it's riskier for a motorcyclist to ride with a passenger behind the rider than to ride alone. Again, if I answer that yes and I answer it no, it does not clearly make my argument one way and break it the other. It's out of the running. However, despite the fact that it may have taken a moment of analysis to get there, if we speak to answer choice A, whether significantly more than 8% of motorcyclists have taken a motorcycle safety course, we have our Pretzels and great white sharks conundrum all over again, right? We're in a situation to where I don't know how many people even take this course in the first place. So if I pose a hypothetical here, we know that for our involved in accidents, right, we've got 8%. So if in general, in our population, right, our population of motorcyclists, 8% take the course, and for those who are involved in accidents, 8% have taken the course, does this give us any decent reason to believe that the course is helpful in any regard? Right? Does this give us reason to believe that if more people took the course, there'd be fewer accidents? No, this is reflective of the population as a whole. This would be like saying, hey, only 8% of the people involved in motorcycle accidents have red hair, so if you dye your hair red, you're less likely to be involved in a motorcycle accident. Well, no, not if it's just a portion of the population that is of a lower percent in the first place, right? If this is indicative of what we would expect out of the population, it doesn't give us any reason to believe that these motorcycle safety courses are helpful. However, if 50% of people take the course and only 8% of the people, because this one's staying the same, involved in accidents have taken the course, well then this tells me that, hey, if half the people take the course, but very few of those who are involved in accidents have taken the course, this leads me to believe this is pretty darn helpful. But what if, and again, a little bit of a silly hypothetical, what if only 2% or 1% of the population take the course? But for those who are involved in accidents, 8% have taken the course. Maybe there's something a little counterproductive about this course and we want to avoid it. Right? So whether it makes sense to use the data of 92% never taking a course or 8% having taken the course to draw the conclusion that the courses are helpful and would lead to fewer motorcycle accidents depends entirely on whether that 8% is representative of the overall population of motorcyclists, higher or lower. And answer choice A addresses precisely that. When we answer it one way, we've totally destroyed our argument. It doesn't make any sense to use that evidence to draw that conclusion anymore. But when we answer it the other way, we're left with a very likely valid argument, or at the very least, we've bridged the gap between the use of that data and the conclusion we've drawn on its basis. And that's precisely what we're trying to do with these useful to evaluate questions. All right. Jump in with questions, with comments, with concerns where we have them. We've gotten just a little bit of a taste of the various ways that data can appear convincing on first glance, but have fatal flaws if we take just a step further to dig into the use of that data. So data in many ways can be misleading, whether we're looking at averages and the fact that they're not necessarily indicative of usual case, whether we're looking at situations to where percents are compared to hard values or percents kind of hang without any sort of information to refer back to. We want to make sure that we look out for powerful statistics or seemingly powerful statistics that just don't have a meaningful or relevant connection, right? And we want to make sure that just as in quant, we're taking the percent of the right thing and that we look out for the difference between the use of percents versus hard values. Sure, let's take a moment to circle back. I want to make sure everyone's feeling super clear on this one. So your confusion here stems from answer choice D. So let's talk about it. So answer choice D, whether more than 92% of serious motorcycle accidents involve collisions between a motorcycle and another vehicle in motion. So if motorcycle accidents involve other vehicles in motion, first of all, right? So first of all, in a situation like this one, first of all, they're talking to the fact that these motorcycle courses prepare them for handling and for sharing the road with others. So whether or not others are involved in these accidents doesn't make or break things, because once again, the likelihood that they're involved in these accidents doesn't change whether they've taken the course or not taken the course purely based on the statistic I've been given in answer choice D. Right? So it doesn't make or break our argument. Certainly, we could look at a situation or try to make a case for the fact that if the motorcyclists are never at fault in some strange way, that maybe there's a case for how it impacts the argument in a certain way. But as it stands, we would anticipate that motorcycle accidents often involve collisions between motorcyclists and other vehicles. There are abundantly more other vehicles on the road than motorcyclists. But it doesn't address whether it makes sense to use this statistic to draw the conclusion that the motorcycle safety courses are helpful. Whereas, with answer choice A, whether significantly more than 8% of motorcyclists, just motorcyclists in general, have taken a motorcycle safety course, if abundantly more than 8%, if let's say 50% have taken the course, but only 8% of the people involved in accidents are those who have taken the course, this gives me good reason to believe that taking the course makes you less likely to be involved in an accident, right? It leaves you better prepared. However, if 8% of people involved in accidents have taken the course and only 8% of the population even takes the course in the first place, this is what I would expect to see if the courses weren't helpful at all, right? Again, I use this example of, this would be like trying to say that motorcyclists with red hair are less likely to be involved in accidents because only 8% of the motorcyclists involved in accidents have red hair. Well, no, this just tells me that, well, what if only 8% of people have red hair? Then that's what we would expect to see, with no indication that that cause affects the conclusion that we make on the basis of it. And if we take it kind of a silly step further, right? If only 1% or 2% of people take the course, if almost nobody takes the course, and 8% of people involved in accidents have taken the course, this tells me this course is counterproductive. We want to steer clear of it. So whether or not it makes sense to use this evidence to draw the given conclusion depends, it hinges completely on how this 8% who have taken the course involved in accidents compares back to the percent of the population who have taken the course. Are we feeling more comfortable with this now? Do we have any lingering questions? Because I will say, it's a quite challenging question, but it is the template of the question, the style of the question, brings up some data-driven flaws that are very frequently occurring. And so we want to make sure you guys are feeling super, super comfortable with how we could be on the lookout for the relevancy or the lack thereof of this data. All right, jump in with questions if you have them. Otherwise, I want to go ahead and round things out for the rest of the class. And again, I'm happy to hang in the chat and answer any lingering questions you guys have for me, whether they're bigger picture or related back to the questions we've just gone through. So the idea here is that there are, in many cases, common patterns to where we may have misleading or potentially flawed data. Not flawed in the sense that the data is incorrect, flawed in the sense that it doesn't make sense to use that data to draw the conclusion that the author of the argument has drawn according to it. So we want to look out for common elements, but we also want to be prepared to see how things may be different on a case-by-case basis. We want to an extent, and I know it sounds counterintuitive to say take the time on the front end, it's going to save you time in the long run, but it genuinely does. If we take the time to break down and understand the question, we're putting ourselves in a better position to move efficiently through the answer choices, be less drawn in by those convincing wrong answers, and find the meaning of the answer that we knew we were looking for along the way, right? And so in terms of the pacing, so this is good. Under time pressure, all of these things don't come to my mind. So one thing I will say, and I know once again, it's going to sound counterintuitive, but I promise it makes a difference. Give yourself the opportunity when you begin to build on your strategies, when you begin to build on your understanding and critical reasoning, allow yourself the time you need to move through the questions. Don't stop yourself when you've hit the 2-minute mark or stop yourself at a certain point in analysis. Take the time you need to move through the questions, but make sure, whether you're formally error logging or just reflecting on a question-by-question basis, I have a really strong preference for error logging. I think it's honestly one of the most consistent differentiators I've seen between students who make really substantial improvements and hit top percentile scores and those who don't. So I'm a big proponent of it, but regardless of how you reflect, make sure you're keeping track of the pacing. Make sure you're seeing, okay, on this question where I spun my wheels for 3 minutes or for 3.5 minutes, what portion of that time was value add and what wasn't? How might I make the distinction, find those cues or indicators earlier on in the process to see how to effectively move through that question, right? So in many cases, part of gaining success on the pacing that you move through with in critical reasoning comes down to building the foundations and then whittling away at the time that isn't actively adding value. So allowing yourself a little more time to build the foundations, to incorporate and reinforce good practices and good habits, and then to identify along the way processes that aren't actively adding value and to whittle away at those processes so that you reach your desired pacing point. So most important part of sentence correction is the part where any conclusion or statement by any person begins. So certainly with our core question types, and we very briefly addressed this earlier, right? In our core question types, like our strengthen and weaken questions, we certainly want to begin by identifying the conclusion and then identifying the why, or the relevant premise behind it, because the connection between those two, the gap and the potentially flawed assumption that fills that gap, is, generally speaking, with these core question types, where we'll want to be focusing our time and energy. Yeah. So with that in mind, so GMAT Club always has some 95% questions which are lacking in general logic, whether you need to practice those. So I will say, in terms of sourcing, general rule of thumb is as close as we can get to recognizing how relevant questions are to their official guide counterparts is probably where you'll want to be focusing your time. And if you find that you have logic-based flaws, that you run into trouble with questions at an earlier level, that you run into trouble with questions at kind of below that 700 level, below the 600 level, make sure you begin by building the foundations, because with the adaptive algorithm of the test, you're not allowing yourself the opportunity to even be exposed to those high-level questions if you haven't built the foundations, if you're not feeling bulletproof at, say, about the medium level. But certainly there is a case for kind of how we make that incremental improvement from there, because it's not entirely new and different strategies. It's taking the things we're already doing well and applying them when the correct answer is a little less punchy, when the convincing wrong answers inch a little bit closer to what we thought we were looking for. Right? So with that in mind, I'll hang out post our lesson and make sure that I address any lingering questions you guys have for me, whether they're in the live chat or in the general chat if we lose the potential to be responding there. For the time being, I want to go ahead and wrap things up, be cognizant of GMAT Club's time, and thanking them once again for giving me the platform to chat with you guys about critical reasoning. So we want to keep in mind that when numeric concepts appear in our critical reasoning questions, we want to be really scrutinous, because there's a good chance that we're being presented with some sort of a data-driven flaw. So thank you guys so much for jumping in with all of your questions, with all of your thoughts and responses throughout the exercises that we went through and through the formal questions. Again, I'll hang out in the chat and answer any questions that you guys have for me along the way. I look forward to being back with you all later in the webinar series. And my colleague, my fellow instructor, Erica, will actually be joining you guys for the next lesson, so definitely be sure to tune in. And in the meantime, thanks for your time and happy studying.